I stood in the enlisted mess hall at Fort Donovan with a tray of meatloaf and mashed potatoes, wearing my standard combat fatigues with no rank insignia visible. Captain Derek Hastings shoved past an older veteran in a wheelchair, laughing as coffee splashed across the man's service ribbons. "Out of the way, Grandpa! War is over! You're taking up space." Then he looked at me and sneered. "What are you staring at, Private?" I set my tray down slowly and replied, "Actually, it's Colonel. Colonel Valerie Brennan. And you just assaulted a decorated veteran in my presence." Have you ever watched someone abuse power they don't deserve while you held back everything you could do to stop them? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. 3 weeks earlier, I had arrived at Fort Donovan under orders that most people wouldn't understand. The Pentagon doesn't advertise when they send field-grade officers undercover to investigate corruption, but that's exactly what I was doing. Reports had surfaced about systematic mistreatment of wounded veterans during their medical retirement processing, falsified disability ratings, and a toxic command climate that was driving good soldiers out of the service. My job was to observe, document, and build an airtight case before anyone knew who I really was. I had spent 16 years earning my rank the hard way. 2 deployments to Afghanistan, 1 to Iraq, a master's degree in military justice, and a spotless record that included a Bronze Star and 3 Army Commendation Medals. I had commanded at every level, from platoon to battalion, and now I was working directly for the Inspector General's office on special assignment. But none of that mattered when I walked through the gates of Fort Donovan that humid September morning. I was just another soldier in standard-issue uniforms, keeping my head down and my mouth shut. The base itself sprawled across North Carolina pine forests, a maze of administrative buildings, training areas, and housing units that had seen better days. Budget cuts had left everything looking worn around the edges. Paint peeled from building facades, grass grew wild in patches where maintenance crews no longer bothered to mow. The whole place felt like it was slowly being forgotten, which made it the perfect environment for the kind of rot I was sent to expose. I was assigned to work in Building 7, the administrative wing where medical retirement paperwork got processed. They put me in a cubicle next to the copy machine, told me to file documents and answer phones, the kind of work that would let me see everything while appearing completely invisible. The woman who trained me was a civilian contractor named Mrs. Chen, who had worked on base for 20 years. She showed me the filing system with tired patients, occasionally glancing toward the corner office where Captain Hastings held court. "Keep your head down around him," she whispered, while demonstrating how to use the ancient fax machine. "He doesn't like it when people ask questions." I nodded, playing the role of the quiet new transfer who just wanted to do her job and go home. But I was already cataloging everything. The way files disappeared from certain desks, how conversations stopped when junior enlisted personnel walked past, the tension that hung in the air like humidity before a thunderstorm. Captain Derek Hastings ran the Medical Retirement Division with the swagger of someone who believed his authority was absolute. He was in his early 40s, career officer who had somehow avoided deployment his entire service, and he treated the position like his personal kingdom. His second-in-command, Lieutenant Bryce Kaufman, followed him around like a loyal dog, laughing at his jokes and enforcing his unwritten rules with petty cruelty. I watched them operate for 2 weeks before the incident in the mess hall. I documented how they delayed paperwork for veterans who complained, how they made elderly soldiers wait in hours in hallways without chairs, how they spoke about wounded warriors like they were burdens, instead of heroes who had sacrificed everything. I kept detailed notes in an encrypted file on my personal laptop, backed up to a secure server that only my commanding officer at the Inspector General's office could access. But I wasn't prepared for Sergeant First Class Howard Drummond.
I first saw him on a Tuesday afternoon when he wheeled himself into Building 7 for an appointment. He was somewhere in his 70s, silver hair cut in a high and tight that probably looked the same since Vietnam. His chair was an older model, manual push, and he struggled slightly getting it over the threshold because the automatic door opener had been broken for months. I stood up from my desk to help, but he waved me off with a gentle smile. "I've got it, soldier. Been doing this long enough." His uniform jacket, worn over civilian clothes, displayed ribbons I recognized immediately. Purple Heart with oak leaf cluster, Silver Star, Combat Infantryman badge with 2 stars. This man had seen more combat than everyone in the building combined, and he was being made to wait in a hallway because Captain Hastings was on an extended lunch break. I brought him water, asked if he needed anything. He thanked me with the kind of dignity that comes from a lifetime of service, then settled in to wait with the patience of someone who had waited for far worse than bureaucratic incompetence. When Hastings finally returned, reeking of the bourbon he thought nobody could smell, he walked past Sergeant Drummond, without acknowledgement. Kaufman followed, actually stepping around the wheelchair like it was an inconvenient piece of furniture. I watched Drummond's shoulders sag slightly, and something in my chest went tight. The appointment itself was a disaster. Through the thin office walls, I could hear Hastings telling Drummond that his paperwork had been lost again, that he would need to resubmit everything, that the process would take another 6 months minimum. The old soldier's voice never rose, never lost its respectful tone, even as he explained that he needed his benefits to process so he could afford his medications. "Should have thought about that before you got old," he said, loud enough for the whole office to hear. "Not my problem you can't keep track of paperwork." Kaufman's laugh echoed through the door. I typed faster, documenting every word. My jaw clenched so hard my teeth ached. This was exactly the kind of behavior I was sent to expose. But I needed more. I needed patterns, multiple incidents, evidence that would hold up under legal scrutiny. One instance of cruelty could be explained away. A pattern of abuse was actionable. So, I waited. I continued playing my role, filing papers and staying invisible, while I watched Hastings and Kaufman operate their small empire of casual cruelty. I started arriving early and leaving late, using my access to copy files when the office was empty, photographing documents that showed systematic delays and deliberate obstruction of veterans' benefits. I recorded conversations using my phone tucked in my pocket, always careful to stay within legal boundaries for evidence collection. I also started spending time with Sergeant Drummond. He came in every week for his appointments that went nowhere, and each time I made sure to check on him, bring him coffee, listen to his stories. He told me about his 3 tours in Vietnam, about the friends he lost, about coming home to a country that didn't want to acknowledge what he had done in its name. He spoke about his wife, who had passed 2 years ago, about his daughter, who lived in California and worried about him constantly. "I don't want to be a burden," he said one afternoon while we waited for yet another delayed appointment. "I served my country. I just want what I was promised. Is that too much to ask?" It wasn't. It absolutely wasn't. And watching this man being ground down by a system that should have been honoring him made my blood boil in ways I hadn't felt since my first combat deployment. I started documenting everything related to Sergeant Drummond specifically.
Every appointment, every delay, every dismissive comment. I pulled his entire file, made copies of everything, and discovered that his paperwork hadn't been lost at all. It had been deliberately held up because Hastings had flagged it for additional review without cause, a bureaucratic trick that could delay processing indefinitely. More than that, I found other files just like his, dozens of elderly veterans, all stuck in the same limbo, all waiting for benefits that were being deliberately withheld. The pattern was clear and damning. But I still needed the smoking gun, the moment where their cruelty became undeniable, even to the most skeptical investigator. That moment came 3 weeks after I arrived in the enlisted mess hall on a Thursday morning. I had gone in for breakfast before my shift, trying to maintain the routine of a regular soldier.
The mess hall was crowded with the early morning rush, soldiers grabbing food before formation, the air thick with the smell of coffee and bacon. I was standing in line with my tray when I saw Sergeant Drummond wheeling himself toward an empty table near the windows. He was alone, moving slowly through the crowded space, and I was about to wave him over to join me when Captain Hastings and Lieutenant Kaufman cut across his path. They were laughing about something, not paying attention, and Hastings' elbow caught the back of Drummond's chair, jolting it hard enough to make the old soldier's coffee slosh over the rim of his cup. The liquid splashed across his chest, staining the service ribbons he wore with such pride. Dark drops scattered across the Silver Star, the Purple Hearts, the combat infantryman badge that represented more courage than Hastings would ever possess. Drummond looked down at his ruined uniform, then up at Hastings with quiet dignity. "Sir, you spilled my coffee." Hastings glanced back, saw who it was, and his lip curled in something between amusement and disgust. "Out of the way, Grandpa. War's over. You're taking up space."
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Kaufman laughed, actually laughed, while an elderly veteran sat there with coffee soaking into metals earned in blood. Other soldiers had stopped eating, watching the scene unfold with varying degrees of discomfort, but nobody moved. Nobody said anything. The unspoken rule was clear: don't cross Hastings. I set my tray on the nearest table. My hands were steady, my mind crystalline with focus. This was the moment, not just for my investigation, but for every soldier who had ever been made to feel small by someone who confused authority with worth. Hastings turned and saw me staring. His eyes narrowed. "What are you looking at, Private?" The mess hall had gone quiet. I could feel dozens of eyes on me, waiting to see if I would back down like everyone else had learned to do. I thought about my orders to stay undercover, to maintain my role until the investigation was complete. I thought about all the careful documentation I had built over the past 3 weeks. Then I looked at Sergeant Drummond, at the coffee dripping from ribbons that represented sacrifices I could barely imagine, and I made my choice. I walked across the mess hall with measured steps, stopping directly in front of Captain Hastings. I met his eyes without blinking. "Actually, it's Colonel Valerie Brennan, and you just assaulted a decorated veteran in my presence." The silence that followed was absolute. You could have heard a pin drop on the linoleum floor. Hastings's face went through several colors, settling on a pale shade that suggested his blood pressure had just spiked dangerously. Kaufman looked like he might be sick. "That's impossible," Hastings stammered. "You're just a transfer. You work in my office." I pulled out my identification from my pocket, the one that had been hidden in my civilian wallet for 3 weeks. "I'm an investigator with the Inspector General's office, deployed here under classified orders, and you've just committed assault on a veteran while demonstrating conduct unbecoming an officer, both of which occurred in front of approximately 60 witnesses." I let that sink in for a moment, watching understanding dawn across his face, like a very unpleasant sunrise. Then I turned to Sergeant Drummond, my voice softening. "Sergeant, are you injured? Do you need medical attention?" "No, ma'am. Just wet and embarrassed." "You have nothing to be embarrassed about." I raised my voice so everyone in the mess hall could hear me. "This soldier served 3 tours in Vietnam, earned a Silver Star for valor under fire, and deserves nothing but respect from every person wearing this uniform. What happened here today is unacceptable, and it ends now." I turned back to Hastings, who had recovered enough of his composure to attempt bluster. "This is entrapment. You can't just show up undercover and expect—" "I can, and I did. Under Article 15 of the Uniform Code of Military Justice, I have the authority to investigate suspected misconduct. Under Article 92, you have the obligation to follow lawful orders and regulations, which include treating all personnel with dignity and respect. You violated both." I paused, letting each word land with precision. "You're confined to quarters pending formal charges.
Lieutenant Kaufman, you're also confined to quarters as a material witness and potential co-conspirator. If either of you attempts to destroy evidence or contact witnesses, I will add obstruction of justice to the charges." Kaufman found his voice thin and desperate. "You can't do this. We have rights. You have the right to remain silent, which I strongly suggest you immediately exercise. You have the right to legal counsel, which you're going to need. And you have the obligation to follow my direct orders starting now." I gestured to 2 military police officers who had appeared at the mess hall entrance, alerted by someone's quick thinking. "Escort these officers to their quarters and ensure they remain there until further notice." As they were led away, Hastings still sputtering protests and Kaufman looking like he might pass out, I knelt beside Sergeant Drummond's wheelchair. "I'm sorry you had to experience this, and I'm sorry it took me this long to step in, but I promise you, what happened here today will be addressed. You and every veteran like you will get what you're owed." His hand, weathered and spotted with age, reached out and patted mine. "I knew you weren't just a regular transfer. You have that look. The same one my commanding officer had back in '68. The look of someone who actually gives a damn." I helped him clean up his uniform as best we could, though the coffee stains would probably never come out completely. Another soldier brought him a fresh cup and a clean towel. Others started approaching, thanking him for his service, apologizing for not speaking up sooner. The atmosphere in the mess hall had shifted entirely from fearful silence to something that felt like collective relief. But I knew this was just the beginning. I had broken my cover and accelerated the timeline of my investigation. Now I needed to move fast, before anyone had time to destroy evidence or coordinate their stories. I had 3 weeks of documentation, but I needed to secure everything immediately and build the formal case that would hold up in a court-martial. As I walked out of the mess hall, heading towards Building 7 with purpose in every step, I felt the weight of what I had just started. Court-martialing an officer was serious business, requiring evidence beyond any reasonable doubt. I would need witness statements, documentation of patterns of behavior, proof of systematic abuse. I had most of it, but I needed to make sure every piece was locked down tight. My phone buzzed with a message from Colonel Patricia Vance, the base commander. "My office, 20 minutes." I had just gone from undercover investigator to the center of what would likely become one of the most talked about cases at Fort Donovan in years. There was no going back now. I had made my choice in that mess hall, prioritizing immediate justice over investigative patience.
Colonel Patricia Vance's office sat at the end of a long corridor in the base headquarters building, a structure that predated most of the personnel currently serving on Fort Donovan. The walls were lined with photographs of previous commanders dating back to the 1950s, stern faces staring down from black and white frames as if judging everyone who walked beneath them. I had never been inside this building during my 3 weeks undercover, and now I was about to explain to the base commander why I had just publicly revealed my identity and confined 2 of her officers to quarters. The secretary outside her office, a specialist with precisely arranged desk supplies and an expression that gave nothing away, gestured for me to enter without asking my name. Apparently, word traveled fast on military installations, even faster when it involved a colonel appearing out of nowhere to drop charges on a captain. Colonel Vance stood behind her desk as I entered, a woman in her late 50s with iron gray hair pulled back in a regulation bun and eyes that had probably seen every variety of military drama imaginable. She did not invite me to sit. Instead, she studied me for a long moment, arms crossed before speaking. Inspector General's office didn't tell me they were sending a field-grade officer. They said they were sending an investigator. I assumed civilian contractor, or maybe a warrant officer doing quiet inquiries. Her voice carried no anger, just a flat statement of fact that somehow felt more intimidating than yelling would have been. "Ma'am, the deception was necessary to observe authentic behavior patterns. If personnel had known a colonel was present, they would have modified their conduct." I kept my posture at attention, even though she had not demanded it, showing respect for her position even as I defended my own actions. She gestured sharply toward the chair across from her desk. "Sit down, Brennan. We're past the point of formal posturing." I sat. She remained standing, which was a power move I recognized, but chose not to challenge.
This was her base, her command, and I had just created a significant problem in her domain. She had every right to be displeased. "I received a preliminary report from your commanding officer at the IG's office about 40 minutes ago," she said, moving to the window that overlooked the central parade ground. "He informed me that you were authorized to remain undercover for up to 60 days before initiating any formal action. You've been here 21 days. Care to explain why you just burned your cover in the middle of the enlisted mess hall?" I had prepared for this question during my walk across the base. "Ma'am, Captain Hastings physically struck a wheelchair-bound veteran's chair, causing hot coffee to spill across the veteran's uniform and service ribbons. He then verbally berated the veteran in front of approximately 60 witnesses, telling him the war was over and he was taking up space. This constituted assault and conduct unbecoming an officer under the UCMJ. As the senior officer present, I had a duty to intervene immediately." Vance turned from the window, her expression unreadable. "You could have intervened without revealing your rank, broken up the situation, filed a report afterward." "Yes, ma'am, I could have, but I made a judgment call that immediate accountability was necessary to prevent further escalation and to demonstrate to every soldier present that such behavior would not be tolerated by command authority. The message needed to be clear and public." She walked back to her desk and sat down heavily, the chair creaking under the sudden weight. For the first time, she looked tired rather than intimidating. "Do you have any idea what kind of firestorm you just created? Hastings has been running that medical retirement division for 3 years. He has connections at division level. His father is a retired 2-star who plays golf with half the Pentagon. The moment you confined him to quarters, he was probably on the phone making calls to everyone he knows." "I understand the political complications, ma'am. But I also have 3 weeks of documented evidence showing systematic abuse of veterans, deliberate delays in benefits processing, falsified paperwork, and a toxic command climate that has been driving good soldiers out of the service. What happened this morning was not an isolated incident. It was the most visible example of a pattern I was sent here to expose." Vance leaned forward, folding her hands on the desk. "Show me." I pulled out my personal laptop from my shoulder bag, the one that had been locked in my barracks room safe whenever I was not actively using it. I opened the encrypted files and turned the screen toward her. "I have detailed logs of every incident I observed, photographs of documents showing delayed paperwork, audio recordings of inappropriate conversations, and witness statements I collected confidentially from junior enlisted personnel who were afraid to report through official channels." She scrolled through the files, her expression growing darker with each page. I watched her jaw tighten as she read transcripts of Hastings making jokes about veterans being too broken to matter. Her fingers paused on a photograph of a filing cabinet where I had found dozens of medical retirement packets that should have been processed months ago, deliberately held back without cause. "How many veterans are affected?" she asked without looking up from the screen. 47 that I can document definitively. Potentially more if we audit the full system going back 2 years. She closed the laptop and pushed it back toward me. "This is worse than the initial report suggested. The IG's office told me they suspected mismanagement and possibly some discrimination. This is criminal neglect at minimum, potentially fraud if Hastings was receiving any benefit from delaying these cases." "I have evidence suggesting he was, ma'am. Several veterans reported being told their paperwork would be expedited if they provided positive feedback on command climate surveys. Others were told they could avoid additional delays if they withdrew formal complaints. That constitutes coercion and possibly bribery under Article 134. Vance stood from the window and walked to a filing cabinet in the corner, pulling out a bottle of water and offering me one. I accepted, suddenly aware that I had not eaten breakfast and my hands were starting to shake slightly from the adrenaline wearing off. She sat back down and opened her own bottle, taking a long drink before speaking again. "Here's what's going to happen. I'm officially taking command of this investigation as of right now. You'll continue as the primary investigator, but everything goes through my office from this point forward. I want every piece of evidence secured and backed up. I want witness statements formalized and notarized. I want a complete audit of every medical retirement case processed through that division for the past 24 months. And I want it all done by the book so that when Hastings' father starts calling in favors, we have an airtight case that can't be dismissed as procedural error or personality conflict. Yes, ma'am. I'll need access to personnel who can assist with the audit. The volume of paperwork is substantial. You'll have whoever you need. I'm assigning Staff Sergeant Ramon Silva from the legal office to assist you. He's solid, discreet, and has experience with UC&J proceedings. I'm also bringing in Major Leonard Briggs from the Judge Advocate General's office. He'll serve as the prosecuting attorney if this goes to court-martial, which I suspect it will. I nodded, already mentally organizing the workload. What about Hastings and Kaufman? They're confined to quarters, but they still have access to phones and computers. There's a risk they'll attempt to contact witnesses or destroy evidence. Vance's expression hardened. I'll have MEPs collect their government-issued devices within the hour. Personal phones they can keep, but I'll make it clear that any attempt to obstruct this investigation will result in additional charges. I'll also assign someone to monitor their quarters. Not a guard, officially, just someone nearby who happens to notice if they try to leave or receive suspicious visitors.
What about the veterans who are currently waiting for their benefits to process? Some of them are in genuine financial distress because of these delays. She considered this for a moment. Make me a priority list. Anyone facing immediate hardship due to delayed benefits processing. I'll personally review their cases and expedite them through an alternate chain of command. This mess is not going to hurt the people who have already suffered enough. I felt something release in my chest, a tension I had been carrying since my first day observing the dysfunction in Building 7. Thank you, ma'am. That means more than you know. Don't thank me yet. You just made yourself the center of what's going to be an extremely ugly fight. Hastings will argue entrapment, procedural violations, bias, anything his lawyers can think of. His father will pressure everyone up the chain to make this go away quietly. You're going to be under a microscope, and every decision you've made during this investigation will be scrutinized. I understand, ma'am. My conduct has been within regulations. My evidence collection followed proper protocols, and my decision to intervene this morning was justified under any reasonable interpretation of an officer's duty. She smiled slightly, the first hint of warmth I had seen from her. You're either very confident or very naive. I hope for your sake it's the former. Dismissed. I want your formal report on my desk by 0800 tomorrow morning. Include everything, every incident, every document, every conversation that's relevant to building this case. We're going to do this right. I stood, gathered my laptop, and headed for the door. As I reached for the handle, she spoke again. Brennan, what you did in that mess hall, standing up for Sergeant Drummond, that took guts. A lot of officers would have waited, built the case quietly, avoided the confrontation. You chose differently. I respect that, even if it complicated my day considerably. Some things are more important than convenience, ma'am. Yes, they are. Now, get to work. I left her office and walked back out into the afternoon heat, the North Carolina sun beating down on the pavement hard enough to make the air shimmer. I had authorization to proceed, resources to build the case, and a base commander who was willing to back me up despite the political complications. That was more than I had hoped for when I walked into that meeting. But I also knew Colonel Vance was right about the fight ahead. Hastings would not go quietly. His connections would try to bury this investigation before it could gain momentum. And I had just made myself a very visible target for anyone who benefited from the current system staying exactly as corrupt as it was. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. I almost ignored it, but something made me check. The message was short and unsigned. Thank you for what you did today. There are more of us who saw what's been happening. We'll help if you need us. I saved the number and kept walking. Allies were going to be critical in the days ahead, especially allies who had witnessed the abuse firsthand. I needed to identify them, protect them from retaliation, and document their testimony before anyone could intimidate them into silence. Building 7 loomed ahead of me, its windows reflecting the afternoon sun like blank eyes. I had walked into that building 3 weeks ago as nobody, just another administrative worker filing papers and answering phones. Now, I was walking back in as the person who was going to dismantle everything Captain Hastings had built.
The lobby was eerily quiet when I entered. Word had obviously spread, because the usual clusters of personnel chatting by the water cooler were gone. People sat at their desks with unusual focus. Nobody making eye contact, everyone suddenly very interested in their computer screens. Mrs. Chen, the civilian contractor who had trained me on my first day, caught my eye from across the room and gave me the smallest nod of approval before returning to her work. I went straight to my cubicle, which suddenly felt absurdly small for someone about to conduct a major investigation. The filing cabinets I had been using were standard issue, completely inadequate for securing evidence. I would need to move everything to a secure location, probably the legal office where Staff Sergeant Silva worked, where access could be controlled and monitored. I started making lists. Witnesses to interview, documents to secure, timelines to construct. The scope of the investigation was larger now that I had revealed myself, no longer limited to covert observation, but expanded to include formal proceedings that would require procedural perfection. My desk phone rang, startling me out of my planning. I picked it up warily. Colonel Brennan, this is Corporal Tasha Greenwood from the administrative office. Colonel Vance asked me to assist you with evidence management and witness coordination. I'm coming over to Building 7 now with secure storage containers and transport authorization. Should I meet you at your current location? Yes, Corporal. I'll be here. Bring everything you have. We're going to need it. She arrived 20 minutes later with a hand truck stacked with locking file boxes and evidence bags. She was younger than I expected, maybe 25. With sharp eyes and an efficiency of movement that suggested she had done this kind of work before. Ma'am, I've worked on 2 previous investigations involving command misconduct. I know how to handle chain of custody documentation and witness protection protocols. Colonel Vance thought my experience would be useful. It will be. Let's start by securing everything in my desk and filing cabinet. Every document gets photographed, logged, and sealed. We're building a case that has to be bulletproof. We worked through the afternoon, boxing up evidence and labeling everything with meticulous detail. Other personnel in the office watched nervously, probably wondering if they were about to be implicated in something. I made a note to interview each of them individually, not as suspects, but as potential witnesses who could describe the environment Hastings had created. By 1700 hours, we had filled 8 boxes with documents, recordings, and photographic evidence. Corporal Greenwood arranged for transport to the legal office where everything would be stored in a locked room with restricted access. As we loaded the last box onto the hand truck, Staff Sergeant Ramon Silva appeared in the doorway. He was a compact man in his early 30s, with the bearing of someone who had seen combat and carried the weight of it quietly. His uniform was immaculate, his expression serious but not unfriendly. Colonel Brennan, I'm Ramon Silva. Colonel Vance assigned me to assist you with your investigation. I've been briefed on the general scope of the case. Where do you want me to start? I gestured to the boxes. Help Corporal Greenwood get these secured in the legal office, then meet me back here at 1800. We need to start identifying and prioritizing witnesses. This case has to move fast before anyone has time to coordinate stories or apply pressure on people to stay quiet. Understood, ma'am. I'll make sure everything is locked down properly. As they wheeled the boxes out, I sat down at my desk and opened my laptop. I needed to start drafting the formal report for Colonel Vance. But first, I wanted to review the footage I had recorded that morning in the mess hall. I had been wearing a small camera clipped to my uniform pocket, standard equipment for undercover investigations, and it had captured everything. I watched the video 3 times, studying every detail. The moment Hastings' elbow hit the wheelchair, the coffee splashing across Sergeant Drummond's ribbons, the look of disgust on Hastings' face as he delivered his cruel dismissal, Kaufman's laugh, the silence from everyone else in the room until I intervened. It was damning footage, but it was also incomplete without context. I needed to show that this was not an isolated incident, but part of a sustained pattern.
That required pulling together all the other evidence I'd collected over 3 weeks and arranging it into a coherent narrative that would make the case undeniable. My phone rang again. This time it was Major Leonard Briggs from the JAG office. Colonel Brennan, I've been assigned as prosecuting counsel for the potential court-martial of Captain Hastings and Lieutenant Kaufman. I've received preliminary briefing materials from Colonel Vance. I need to meet with you as soon as possible to review evidence and discuss charging strategy. Are you available this evening? I am, Major. I'm in Building 7, Administrative Wing. I can meet you here or at the legal office. Legal office is better, more secure. I'll see you there at 1900 hours. Bring everything you have. We need to assess what charges we can support and what additional evidence we need to collect. The call ended. I checked the time. 1830. I had 30 minutes to prepare for what would likely be a very long night of legal analysis and strategy planning. I gathered my laptop and notes, locked my desk, and headed for the legal office. The base was quieter now, as most personnel headed to dinner or back to their barracks. Streetlights were starting to flicker on, casting long shadows across the sidewalks. I passed the enlisted mess hall where everything had started just hours ago, its windows glowing warm in the gathering dusk. Sergeant Drummond was probably back in his quarters now, hopefully understanding that what had happened today was just the beginning of holding people accountable. I made a mental note to check on him tomorrow, to let him know that his case would be expedited and that his dignity would be restored as much as the system could manage. The legal office occupied the ground floor of a 2-story building near the base headquarters. Staff Sergeant Silva was waiting outside when I arrived, standing at ease but clearly alert. "Everything's secured, ma'am. Corporal Greenwood is inside cataloging the boxes according to evidence protocols. Major Briggs called ahead. He's bringing case files from previous investigations involving similar charges. Said it would help us understand what evidence standards we need to meet." Good thinking. Has there been any contact from Hastings or Kaufman? Any attempts to reach out to witnesses or interfere with the investigation? Not that I'm aware of, ma'am. MPs collected their government devices without incident. Both officers are confined to their quarters under observation. So far, they're complying with orders. That won't last. Once they talk to lawyers, they'll start fighting back. We need to be ready. We entered the legal office together. The building smelled like old paper and floor wax, institutional scents that probably existed in every military legal office across the world. Corporal Greenwood had set up a work area in the main conference room, boxes arranged on tables, a whiteboard already covered with timeline markers and evidence categories. "I took the liberty to start an organizational system, ma'am," she said when I entered. "Physical evidence sorted by type and date, digital evidence indexed in a spreadsheet with file locations and relevance tags. Witness lists started based on names I found in your documentation. I figured we could expand it as we go." I studied her work. It was exactly what needed to be done, executed with a level of competence that suggested she had done this before. Outstanding work, Corporal. This is going to save us significant time. Have you worked criminal investigations previously? Yes, ma'am. I was assigned to CID for 2 years before transferring to administrative work. I requested the transfer after my 3rd deployment. Combat investigations were taking a toll, but I still remember the procedures. CID, Criminal Investigation Command. That explained her efficiency and attention to detail. "I'm glad to have you on this team. Your experience is going to be invaluable." Major Briggs arrived exactly at 1900 hours, carrying a leather briefcase and wearing the kind of harried expression of a lawyer who had just been handed a complicated case on short notice. He was in his 40s, with graying hair and the kind of sharp eyes that missed nothing. "Colonel Brennan, good to meet you officially. I've read your preliminary materials. This is either going to be the easiest case I've ever prosecuted or an absolute nightmare, depending on how well your evidence holds up under scrutiny. Let's find out which." We spent the next 4 hours dissecting every piece of evidence I had collected. Major Briggs was thorough to the point of being brutal, challenging every conclusion, questioning every connection, playing the role of defense attorney to test how the evidence would hold up under cross-examination. This recording, where Hastings makes jokes about veterans being burdens, when was it recorded? September 15th, approximately 1500 hours in his office. Who else was present? Lieutenant Kaufman and 2 civilian contractors from the Medical Records Department. Have you interviewed the civilians? Not yet. They're on my witness list. Do it tomorrow. We need their statements locked down before defense counsel gets to them. If they confirm what's on this recording, it establishes pattern of behavior. If they claim they don't remember or try to downplay it, we need to know that early. He moved to the next piece of evidence, a memo I had photographed showing Hastings ordering his staff to flag certain veterans' files for additional review without stated cause. This memo, where did you find it? In a filing cabinet in his office, during a routine search I conducted under my investigative authority. Was the cabinet locked? No. Good. Defense can't claim a legal search if the material was openly accessible. What about the other documents in that cabinet? Did you photograph everything or just select items?
Everything. I have a complete photographic inventory. Excellent. Shows you weren't cherry-picking evidence. That's going to matter when we present it to the court-martial panel. We continued like this, evidence by evidence, building the structure of a case that could withstand the intense scrutiny a court-martial would bring. Major Briggs was impressed by the thoroughness of my documentation, but kept pushing for more corroboration, more witnesses, more physical proof that would make the case impossible to deny. Here's my assessment, he said, at around 2300 hours. You have enough evidence to charge Hastings with conduct unbecoming an officer, dereliction of duty, and assault. The assault charge is solid based on the mess hall incident and the video evidence. The conduct and dereliction charges are supported by patterns of behavior documented over multiple incidents. What's harder to prove is criminal intent. Did he deliberately delay benefits for personal gain, or was he just incompetent and cruel? Does it matter legally? I asked. Either way, he violated his duties and harmed veterans under his authority. It matters for sentencing. Incompetence might get him a reprimand and forced retirement. Criminal intent could mean prison time and dishonorable discharge. If you want the latter, we need to find evidence of motive. Why was he delaying these cases? Was there financial benefit, political pressure, personal vengeance? There has to be a reason beyond just being a terrible person. I thought about this. I'll need to dig deeper into his finances and communications, see if there's something I missed. Do it. And talk to more people who worked with him. Someone knows why he operated this way. Someone always knows. We wrapped up the meeting with a plan for the next 72 hours. Witness interviews, financial audits, additional evidence collection. Everything moving toward formal charges that would be filed by the end of the week. As I walked back to my barracks in the early morning darkness, exhausted but determined, I thought about Sergeant Drummond sitting in that mess hall with coffee staining his medals, about the 47 other veterans whose lives had been disrupted by bureaucratic cruelty, about every soldier who had stayed silent because speaking up seemed pointless against entrenched authority.
This case was bigger than Hastings. It was about whether this system could hold itself accountable, whether justice meant anything beyond just following orders. And I was going to make sure the answer was yes, no matter how hard the fight became. The first witness interview started at 06:30 the next morning. I had chosen to begin with Mrs. Chen, the civilian contractor who had trained me on my first day in Building 7. She had worked on base longer than almost anyone else in the administrative division, which meant she had seen the culture shift when Hastings took command 3 years ago. More importantly, she had been present for conversations I had recorded, and I needed her to verify what she had witnessed. We met in a small conference room in the legal office, just me, Mrs. Chen, and Staff Sergeant Silva, taking notes. I had deliberately kept the setting informal, wanting her to feel comfortable rather than interrogated. She arrived with a thermos of tea and the same quiet dignity she brought to everything. Mrs. Chen, thank you for meeting with me this early. I know this situation is uncomfortable, but I need to ask you about what you've observed working in the medical retirement division. She poured herself tea with steady hands, took a sip, and looked directly at me. I've been waiting 3 years for someone to ask these questions. I filed 2 complaints through the Civilian Personnel Office about Captain Hastings' treatment of veterans. Both were dismissed as personality conflicts. I stopped filing after the second one because it became clear nobody wanted to hear it. Silva's pen moved across his notepad. I leaned forward slightly. Tell me what you witnessed. She described a systematic pattern of cruelty that went far beyond what I had documented in my 3 weeks undercover. Veterans being made to wait in hallways for appointments that were deliberately canceled at the last minute. Paperwork being misfiled repeatedly, requiring veterans to resubmit the same documents over and over. Hastings and Kaufman making jokes about wounded soldiers, calling them broken merchandise, and asking why they could not just accept their uselessness gracefully. There was one man, a retired master sergeant, who had lost both legs in Iraq. He came in every month for 6 months trying to get his benefits processed. Captain Hastings told him he should be grateful the Army even bothered with cripples anymore. Her voice remained steady, but her hands tightened around the thermos. That man died last year. Heart attack. His widow told me he had been so stressed about the delays that his blood pressure medication stopped working. I felt cold despite the warm room.
Did you document any of this? I kept personal notes, dates, times, what was said. I didn't know what else to do with them, but I kept them in case someone ever cared enough to investigate. She pulled a small notebook from her purse, pages filled with neat handwriting. You can have this. I made copies. The notebook was a chronicle of institutional failure, page after page of incidents that should have triggered command intervention, but had instead been ignored or covered up. I accepted it carefully, knowing it would become a crucial piece of evidence. Mrs. Chen, one more question. On September 15th, there was a conversation in Captain Hastings' office about veterans being burdens on the system. You were present along with another civilian contractor. Do you remember that conversation? Her expression hardened. I remember. He said wounded veterans were like old dogs that should be put down instead of draining resources. Lieutenant Kaufman laughed. The other contractor, Mr. Phillips, looked uncomfortable but didn't say anything. I left the room as soon as I could. Would you be willing to testify to this under oath at a court-martial proceeding? She met my eyes without hesitation. Yes, I've been waiting for the chance. The interview lasted another hour, covering incident after incident, building a detailed picture of an office where cruelty had become standard operating procedure. When Mrs. Chen finally left, Silva looked up from his notes with a grim expression. Ma'am, if even half of what she described is accurate, this is bigger than conduct unbecoming. This is systematic abuse of authority resulting in harm to service members. We might be looking at Article 93 charges. Article 93, cruelty and maltreatment. It carried significant penalties, including potential prison time. Let's see what the other witnesses say. I don't want to overcharge based on one interview, no matter how credible. But the pattern held. Over the next 2 days, I interviewed 17 people who had worked in or around the medical retirement division. Junior enlisted personnel who had been ordered to misfile paperwork, other officers who had tried to question Hastings' methods and been told to mind their own business, civilians who had witnessed the abuse but felt powerless to stop it. Each interview added another layer of documentation, another piece of evidence that this was not isolated incidents, but a sustained campaign of mistreatment. The most difficult interview was with Sergeant Drummond himself. I met him at the small off-base coffee shop called Grounded, wanting to talk somewhere he felt comfortable rather than in an official military setting. He arrived early, his wheelchair navigating the narrow doorway with practiced ease, and he had already ordered coffee for both of us by the time I sat down. You didn't have to do this, Colonel, he said quietly. What happened in the mess hall? I've dealt with worse. You shouldn't have to deal with any of it, Sergeant. You earned better treatment than what you received. He stirred his coffee slowly, staring into the dark liquid. I kept telling myself it would get better, that if I just waited a little longer, filled out one more form, came to one more appointment, eventually the system would work the way it was supposed to. But it never did. And I started wondering if maybe they were right. Maybe I was just taking up space. The resignation in his voice cut deeper than any of Hastings' recorded insults. This was what institutional cruelty did. It made people doubt their own worth, internalize the abuse until they believed they deserved it. Sergeant Drummond, I need to ask you about your interactions with Captain Hastings over the past year. I know it's difficult, but your testimony is critical to holding him accountable. He nodded slowly and began talking. The story that emerged was even worse than I had feared. Appointments canceled without notice, paperwork deliberately lost multiple times, phone calls that went unreturned for weeks. Hastings had once told him directly that the Army had better things to do than process benefits for soldiers who should have had the decency to die in combat instead of coming home broken. I wanted to file a complaint, Drummond said, his voice barely above a whisper, but I was afraid they would retaliate by delaying my case even longer. I couldn't afford that. My medications, my rent, everything depended on getting those benefits processed. So I stayed quiet and took whatever they dished out. You were placed in an impossible position. That's on them, not you. I pulled out a formal witness statement form. I need you to write down everything you just told me. Dates, if you remember them, specific quotes, if possible, anything that helps establish the pattern. This statement will be used in the court-martial proceedings. Are you willing to testify in person if needed?
He took the form with hands that trembled slightly. Will it help other veterans? Will it stop this from happening to someone else? That's the goal, to make sure nobody else has to go through what you experienced. Then yes, I'll testify. I'll do whatever it takes. While witness interviews continued, Corporal Greenwood was conducting a financial audit of Hastings' accounts. What she found added an entirely new dimension to the investigation. Hastings had been receiving consulting fees from a private veterans advocacy group that supposedly helped veterans navigate the benefits process.
The group charged veterans hundreds of dollars for services that should have been provided free through official channels, and Hastings had been steering frustrated veterans toward this group, collecting referral payments for each one. "Ma'am, this is fraud," Greenwood said, spreading bank statements across the conference table. He was deliberately creating delays and obstacles, making veterans desperate enough to pay for outside help, then profiting from their desperation. Over the past 2 years, he received over $40,000 in referral fees. Major Briggs studied the documents with the focused intensity of a prosecutor who had just found the smoking gun. This changes everything. We're not just talking about conduct violations anymore. This is criminal conspiracy, fraud against the government, and theft of services. Defense counsel won't be able to dismiss this as personality conflicts or mismanagement. This is black and white criminality. I felt a surge of vindication mixed with disgust. I had known Hastings was cruel, but discovering he had been profiting from that cruelty added a dimension of calculated evil that made the whole situation even more reprehensible. What about Kaufman? Is he implicated in the financial scheme? Greenwood shook her head. I haven't found evidence of that yet. He seems to have been more of an enabler than a direct participant in the fraud, but I'm still going through his accounts. Keep digging. If he knew about the scheme and didn't report it, that's still a violation, even if he wasn't receiving payments directly. The investigation expanded rapidly. I brought in 2 additional personnel from the Criminal Investigation Command to help with the financial forensics. We subpoenaed records from the private advocacy group, discovering that Hastings had referred over 60 veterans to them, collecting fees that ranged from $300 to $800 per referral. The group itself was operating in a legal gray area, providing services that were not technically illegal, but were certainly unethical, given that free assistance was available through official channels. By the end of the week, we had built a case that went far beyond the assault in the mess hall. The charges now included conduct unbecoming an officer, cruelty and maltreatment under Article 93, fraud against the United States under Article 132, conspiracy under Article 81, and dereliction of duty under Article 92. Kaufman faced charges of dereliction of duty and failure to report misconduct, though we were still investigating whether his involvement went deeper. Colonel Vance reviewed the complete case file in her office on Friday afternoon, reading through page after page of evidence with an expression that grew darker by the minute. When she finally looked up, she appeared both furious and exhausted. This is worse than anything I anticipated. I've been commanding this base for 18 months. How did this operate under my radar for 3 years? Ma'am, Hastings was careful to keep his activities contained within his division. He discouraged veterans from filing official complaints, intimidated junior personnel into silence, and dismissed concerns from civilians as personality conflicts. The system has multiple points where this should have been caught, but he exploited every gap. She closed the file with a decisive snap. I'm forwarding this to the staff judge advocate with a recommendation for immediate court-martial proceedings under Article 32. I want preliminary hearings scheduled within 2 weeks. I'm also initiating a comprehensive review of our entire benefits processing system to identify any other areas where similar abuse might be occurring. This is unacceptable at every level. Ma'am, there's one more thing. We've identified 47 veterans whose cases were deliberately delayed. Some of them are facing genuine financial hardship because of those delays. I'd like authorization to expedite their cases through an alternate processing chain. Granted. In fact, I want you to personally oversee that process. Make sure those veterans get everything they're entitled to, and make sure they get it fast. They've waited long enough. That evening, I returned to my barracks feeling the weight of the week pressing down on my shoulders. We had built a strong case, stronger than I had hoped when I first arrived at Fort Donovan 5 weeks ago. But I also knew the hardest part was still ahead. The preliminary hearing would give Hastings and his lawyers their first opportunity to challenge the evidence, question witnesses, and try to poke holes in the prosecution's case. And beyond the legal proceedings, there was the human element.
The veterans who had been harmed needed to see justice done, needed to believe the system could correct itself when it failed them. My phone rang. Unknown number, but I answered anyway. Colonel Brennan, this is Attorney Marcus Feldman. I've been retained to represent Captain Hastings in the proceedings against him. I'm calling as a professional courtesy to inform you that we will be filing multiple motions challenging the admissibility of evidence collected during your undercover operation. We believe your methods constituted entrapment and violated my client's rights to due process. I kept my voice neutral. Mr. Feldman, I appreciate the courtesy call. All evidence was collected in accordance with proper investigative protocols and within the scope of my authority as an Inspector General investigator. I'm confident it will withstand legal scrutiny. We'll see about that, Colonel. My client is a decorated officer with an exemplary service record. This investigation appears to be a vindictive overreach by someone with an agenda. We intend to demonstrate that in court. Your client systematically abused veterans under his authority and profited financially from their suffering. The evidence speaks for itself. I look forward to presenting it at the preliminary hearing. The line went dead. I had expected aggressive defense tactics, but the call confirmed that Hastings was mounting a serious legal challenge. Feldman was a well-known military defense attorney with a reputation for aggressive cross-examination and creative legal arguments. This was not going to be a simple proceeding. I spent the weekend preparing for that challenge, going through every piece of evidence with Staff Sergeant Silva and Corporal Greenwood, making sure chain of custody was properly documented, verifying that witness statements were consistent and detailed, checking that all procedures had been followed to the letter. Major Briggs joined us on Sunday afternoon bringing case law citations and procedural guidance for handling entrapment claims. The defense will argue that you created an artificial situation designed to trap Hastings into bad behavior. They'll say that by going undercover, you were essentially manufacturing evidence rather than observing genuine misconduct. We need to be ready to demonstrate that everything you documented was consistent with established patterns that existed before you arrived. We have Mrs. Chen's notebook documenting incidents going back 3 years. We have the financial records showing the referral scheme was operating long before I got here. We have veterans who suffered under his authority before I ever set foot on this base. The pattern was established. I just documented it. That's our argument. But we need to present it clearly and persuasively. Defense will try to make this about your methods rather than Hastings' actions. We can't let them shift focus away from the victims. Monday morning brought a development I had not anticipated. I received an email from the private advocacy group that had been paying Hastings referral fees. Their attorney wanted to cooperate with the investigation in exchange for immunity from prosecution. They were willing to provide complete records of their arrangement with Hastings, including emails where he had explicitly promised to create delays that would drive desperate veterans to seek their services. This is exactly what we needed, Major Briggs said when I showed him the email. Direct communication between Hastings and the advocacy group, establishing intent.
This proves the delays were deliberate, not just incompetence. Defense can't argue he was simply bad at his job when we have evidence showing he was creating problems on purpose for financial gain. We arranged a meeting with the advocacy group's attorney for Tuesday. They arrived with boxes of records, including a spreadsheet tracking every veteran Hastings had referred and every payment he had received. The scheme had been even more extensive than we initially realized. Over 3 years, Hastings had referred 93 veterans and collected nearly $75,000 in referral fees. The advocacy group's representative, a nervous man in his 50s, named Gerald Winters, explained how the arrangement had started. Captain Hastings approached us about 2.5 years ago, said he knew veterans who were frustrated with the official process and might be willing to pay for faster service. We thought it was just networking, helping connect people with resources. We didn't realize he was deliberately creating the delays that made our services seem necessary. When did you become aware that the delays were intentional? I asked. Winters shifted uncomfortably. About 6 months ago. One of our clients mentioned that Captain Hastings had told him his paperwork would be processed faster if he used our services. That seemed inappropriate, for we started asking questions. When we confronted Captain Hastings, he laughed it off, said we were overthinking things. But we started keeping more detailed records after that, just in case. Those detailed records were now spread across the conference table, providing a paper trail that would be impossible for defense counsel to dismiss or explain away. Combined with the witness testimony and the financial forensics, we had built a case that was airtight from multiple angles. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for Thursday morning.
I spent Wednesday doing final preparation with Major Briggs, reviewing the order in which we would present evidence, preparing responses to anticipated defense objections, and running through mock cross-examinations so I would be ready for whatever Feldman threw at me on the stand. Remember, Briggs coached, defense will try to make you angry, try to get you to respond emotionally. Stay calm, stick to facts, don't speculate or exaggerate. The evidence is strong enough to speak for itself. You just need to present it clearly and let it do the work. I went to bed early Wednesday night, setting my alarm for 0500 hours. The preliminary hearing would determine whether the case moved forward to a full court-martial. Based on the evidence we had assembled, I was confident it would. But confidence did not eliminate nervousness. This was the moment where everything I had worked for over the past 5 weeks would either hold up under legal scrutiny or begin to unravel. Thursday morning arrived cold and gray, October settling into North Carolina with morning fog that hung low over the base. I dressed in my service uniform with my full-rank insignia visible, the silver eagles on my shoulders representing authority I had hidden for weeks. Today, there would be no pretending to be someone I was not. Today, I would stand as a colonel, an investigator, and an advocate for veterans who had been silenced for too long. The hearing room was in the base legal building, a formal space with wood paneling and the American flag standing in the corner. The investigating officer, Lieutenant Colonel James Morrison from Division Headquarters, sat at the head table reviewing case files. Captain Hastings sat at the defense table with his attorney, Marcus Feldman, both of them wearing expressions of confident superiority. Lieutenant Kaufman sat at a separate defense table with his own counsel, looking significantly less confident than his former superior. I took my seat at the prosecution table next to Major Briggs. Behind us, in the gallery seating, sat Sergeant Drummond in his wheelchair, Mrs. Chen with her hands folded in her lap, and several other veterans who had agreed to testify. Their presence reminded me why this mattered beyond legal technicalities and procedural victories. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison called the hearing to order at precisely 0800 hours. This is an Article 32 preliminary hearing to determine whether sufficient evidence exists to proceed with court-martial charges against Captain Derek Hastings and Lieutenant Bryce Kaufman. Major Briggs, you may present the government's case. Briggs stood, his voice clear and commanding. Sir, the government will demonstrate that Captain Hastings engaged in a systemic pattern of abuse toward veterans under his authority, that he deliberately delayed benefits processing for personal financial gain, and that his conduct violated multiple articles of the Uniform Code of Military Justice. We have documentary evidence, witness testimony, and financial records that establish these facts beyond reasonable doubt. And with that, the formal presentation of our case began. The moment of truth had arrived. Major Briggs opened with the video footage from the mess hall incident. The room fell silent as the screen mounted on the wall displayed those crucial moments. Hastings' elbow striking the wheelchair, coffee splashing across Sergeant Drummond's chest, darkening the fabric where his service ribbons hung. The sneer on Hastings' face as he delivered his cruel dismissal. Kaufman's laughter cutting through the background noise of the crowded dining facility. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison watched without expression, but I noticed his jaw tighten when Hastings said the words about being over and taking up space. When the clip ended, Morrison turned to the defense table. Mr. Feldman, does your client dispute the authenticity of this recording? Feldman stood smoothly, projecting the confidence of someone who had planned his response carefully. Sir, we do not dispute that the incident occurred. However, we contend that this was an accidental collision in a crowded space and that my client's words, while perhaps poorly chosen in the heat of the moment, do not constitute assault or evidence of systematic misconduct. Captain Hastings had just returned from a stressful meeting with division leadership regarding budget constraints affecting his entire department. He was distracted and frustrated, and this unfortunate encounter occurred at a moment when his patience was depleted. Briggs responded immediately. Sir, if I may address counsel's characterization, the video clearly shows Captain Hastings making eye contact with Sergeant Drummond before delivering his statement. This was not a heat-of-the-moment reaction, but a deliberate verbal assault on a veteran in a wheelchair. Furthermore, the government will demonstrate that this incident was not isolated, but part of an established pattern. Morrison nodded. Continue with your evidence presentation, Major. Briggs called Mrs. Chen to the stand. She walked to the witness chair with the same quiet composure she brought to everything, placed her hand on the Bible, and swore to tell the truth. Briggs guided her through her testimony methodically, establishing her credentials as a long-term employee, her daily interactions with Hastings and his staff, and finally the specific incidents she had witnessed over 3 years. Mrs. Chen, can you describe the general atmosphere in the medical retirement division during Captain Hastings' command? She took a breath before answering. It was hostile toward the veterans we were supposed to be serving. Captain Hastings made it clear that he viewed them as inconveniences rather than people deserving respect. He would complain loudly about how much time their cases required. He made jokes about their disabilities. He created an environment where treating veterans poorly was normalized. Can you provide specific examples? She pulled out her personal notebook, the one she had kept for 3 years, and began reading dated entries. A veteran with PTSD being told to stop being dramatic when he had a panic attack in the waiting area.
An amputee being asked why he bothered showing up to appointments when his case was hopeless anyway. A widow seeking survivor benefits being told she should just remarry someone who was not a burden on the system. Feldman objected repeatedly, arguing that personal notes were not reliable evidence, that memories could be faulty, that Mrs. Chen might have misunderstood context or tone. But Morrison allowed the testimony, noting that witness recollection was standard evidence in military proceedings and that the detailed contemporary notes supported credibility. When Feldman's turn came for cross-examination, he tried to undermine her testimony by suggesting she had a personal vendetta against Hastings, that perhaps she had been reprimanded for poor work performance and was seeking revenge through false accusations. Mrs. Chen remained unshakable. Mr. Feldman, I have received satisfactory performance reviews for 20 consecutive years. I have no personal animosity toward Captain Hastings beyond what any decent person would feel watching someone abuse their authority. I documented what I witnessed because I hoped someday someone would care enough to stop it. Feldman shifted tactics, trying to suggest she had misinterpreted humor as hostility, that military culture included rough language that civilians might not understand properly. She shut that down just as firmly. I have worked on military installations for 2 decades. I understand military culture. What I witnessed was not rough humor. It was cruelty directed at vulnerable people who had sacrificed for their country. When she stepped down from the witness stand, I saw Hastings whisper something to Feldman, his face flushed with anger. Whatever control he had been maintaining was starting to crack. Briggs called Sergeant Drummond next. The bailiff helped position his wheelchair near the witness stand, adjusting the microphone so he could be heard clearly. Drummond raised his right hand to be sworn in, and I noticed it trembled slightly. Not from fear, but from the weight of finally being heard after years of being dismissed. Sergeant Drummond, how long have you been trying to process your medical retirement benefits through Fort Donovan? 14 months, sir. I submitted my initial paperwork in August of last year. What is the typical processing time for medical retirement cases? According to regulations, 60 to 90 days for straightforward cases. Mine should have been straightforward. My medical documentation was complete. My service record was clear. There was no legitimate reason for delays. What reasons were you given for the delays? Drummond's voice remained steady as he recounted the litany of excuses. Lost paperwork that he had to resubmit 3 times, additional medical evaluations that were never actually scheduled, administrative reviews that seemed to exist solely to extend the timeline. Through it all, appointments with Hastings that accomplished nothing except making him feel smaller and more hopeless. Sergeant, can you describe the incident in the mess hall from your perspective? He described wheeling himself toward an empty table, focused on not spilling his coffee, when the impact jarred his chair hard enough that liquid sloshed over the rim and onto his uniform. He described looking up to see Hastings staring down at him with undisguised contempt. He repeated the words about the war being over and taking up space, his voice never wavering, but his hands gripping the armrests of his wheelchair tighter. How did that make you feel? Like everything I had done in uniform meant nothing. Like I was invisible, except as an inconvenience. Like maybe they were right and I should just stop bothering them. The gallery was absolutely silent. Even Feldman seemed to recognize that attacking this witness would be a catastrophic mistake. When Morrison asked if defense had questions, Feldman simply said he reserved the right to recall the witness later, a tactical retreat that everyone recognized for what it was. Briggs moved through additional witnesses efficiently. A junior enlisted soldier who had been ordered to misfile paperwork, a captain from another division who had questioned Hastings' methods and been told to stay in his lane, a nurse from the medical clinic who had witnessed Hastings berating elderly veterans in the waiting room. Each testimony added another layer, building an undeniable picture of systematic abuse. Then Briggs introduced the financial evidence. Corporal Greenwood took the stand, her testimony precise and devastating as she walked through bank records, spreadsheets, and email correspondence. She displayed charts showing the flow of money from the advocacy group to Hastings' personal account, $75,000 over 30 months. Nearly 100 veterans referred. Each one charged hundreds of dollars for services that should have been free. Corporal Greenwood, in your analysis of these financial records, did you find any indication that Captain Hastings disclosed this income to military authorities as required by ethics regulations? No, sir. There is no record of any disclosure. Additionally, the income was not reported on his last 2 annual financial disclosure statements, which constitutes a separate violation. Feldman objected, arguing that the financial relationship with the advocacy group was legitimate consulting work, that there was nothing illegal about providing referrals to veterans who wanted additional assistance. Morrison overruled the objection, noting that whether the activity was legitimate would be determined by examining all the evidence, including intent and the circumstances surrounding the referrals. The email correspondence sealed Hastings' fate. Briggs displayed messages on the courtroom screen, communications between Hastings and Gerald Winters from the advocacy group. In one email, Hastings had written explicitly about creating processing delays that would make veterans desperate enough to pay for outside help. In another, he discussed which veterans seemed most likely to have available funds for services. In a third, he calculated his expected referral income for the upcoming quarter based on how many cases he planned to obstruct. The room remained silent as the emails appeared one after another on the screen. There was no ambiguity, no room for alternative interpretation. Hastings had been deliberately harming veterans for profit, documenting his scheme in his own words. When Feldman stood for cross-examination of Corporal Greenwood, his previous confidence had evaporated. He tried to suggest the emails had been taken out of context, that other correspondence would show legitimate business discussions rather than criminal conspiracy. Greenwood calmly noted that she had reviewed all correspondence between Hastings and the advocacy group, and that the pattern was consistent throughout. Every exchange focused on maximizing referrals and income rather than serving veterans' needs. Morrison called a recess for lunch. As people filed out of the courtroom, I saw Hastings arguing intensely with Feldman in heated whispers. Kaufman sat alone at his table, looking like he wanted to disappear entirely. In the gallery, Sergeant Drummond was surrounded by other veterans who had come to show support, their presence a reminder that this case affected real people with real consequences. I met with Major Briggs in a small conference room adjacent to the courtroom. He was reviewing notes for the afternoon session, preparing to address any additional defense arguments. That went better than I expected. Feldman's struggling because there's no good defense for those emails. He'll probably try to separate Hastings from Kaufman, argue that Kaufman was just following orders and didn't know about the financial scheme. What about the entrapment argument? He hasn't raised it yet. He's saving it for when he puts Hastings on the stand. My guess is he'll try to portray my undercover operation as improper government conduct, argue that you manipulated circumstances to make Hastings look bad.
We need to be ready to demonstrate that everything you documented was behavior that existed before you arrived. When the hearing reconvened, Feldman did exactly what Briggs had predicted. He called Hastings to testify, and for the first time, the accused officer spoke in his own defense. Hastings took the stand projecting wounded dignity, the bearing of someone who believed he was the victim of gross injustice. Feldman led him through establishing his service record, his deployments, his awards and commendations. Then he moved to the heart of the defense strategy. Captain Hastings, were you aware that Colonel Brennan was conducting an undercover investigation of your division? No, sir. I believed she was a regular administrative transfer working in a junior capacity. Did her presence and conduct affect how you operated? It created stress and disruption. She asked unusual questions, seemed to be documenting things that were routine administrative matters. I felt like I was under surveillance in my own workplace, which affected my ability to manage effectively. Feldman leaned into this narrative, suggesting that my investigation had created an artificial environment of tension and suspicion, that Hastings had been pushed to his breaking point by months of psychological pressure he did not understand. The mess hall incident in this version became an unfortunate reaction to that accumulated stress rather than evidence of inherent cruelty. Captain Hastings, what about the financial relationship with the Veterans Advocacy Group? Can you explain how that arrangement developed? Hastings shifted in his seat, choosing his words carefully. I believed I was providing a legitimate service by connecting frustrated veterans with resources that could help them. The advocacy group offered assistance that complemented official channels. The referral fees were disclosed to them, and I believe the arrangement was ethical. Did you deliberately delay benefits processing to drive veterans toward the advocacy group? Absolutely not. Any delays were due to legitimate administrative requirements and the complexity of medical retirement cases. The system has inherent inefficiencies that I was working within, not creating. It was a carefully constructed defense, hitting all the points that might create reasonable doubt. But Feldman had made a critical mistake by putting Hastings on the stand, because now Briggs had the opportunity for cross-examination. Briggs stood slowly, gathering his notes with deliberate care. When he approached the witness stand, his demeanor had shifted from the professional courtesy of direct examination to something sharper and more confrontational. Captain Hastings, you testified that you were unaware Colonel Brennan was conducting an undercover investigation. But the behavior she documented, was that behavior new for you, or had you been operating that way before she arrived? I don't accept the characterization of my behavior that's been presented in this proceeding. That's not what I asked. The emails presented earlier, the ones where you discussed creating delays to drive referrals, when were those written? Hastings hesitated. I would need to review the dates. Let me help you. The earliest email in evidence is dated 14 months before Colonel Brennan arrived at Fort Donovan. The pattern of correspondence shows this arrangement existed for over 2 years. So your claim that Colonel Brennan's investigation created stress that affected your conduct, that doesn't explain behavior that predates her presence, does it? The emails are being taken out of context. Really? Let me read one back to you. This is from an email you sent to Mr. Winters dated March 12th. Quote, I'm sitting on 15 cases right now that should process in the next month, but I can stretch most of them to 90 days with additional review requirements. These guys are getting desperate, which means they're ready to pay for help. Expect 5 or 6 referrals in April. End quote. Captain Hastings, what context makes that statement acceptable? The courtroom had gone completely still. Hastings' face flushed, his earlier composure cracking visibly. I was simply managing workflow. By deliberately extending processing times beyond regulatory requirements for veterans who had already sacrificed in service to their country and collecting money for doing so, I provided a service that connected veterans with resources. Resources they needed because you were deliberately obstructing the free services they were entitled to through official channels. Let's talk about Sergeant Drummond specifically. His case has been pending for 14 months. Can you identify any legitimate administrative reason why his straightforward medical retirement has taken that long? Hastings glanced toward his attorney, but Feldman could offer no help. There were complications in his medical documentation. His medical records are complete and unambiguous. Multiple physicians have certified his disability ratings. What specific complications required 14 months of processing? Silence stretched across the courtroom. Hastings had no answer because there was no legitimate answer. His entire operation had been designed to create obstacles where none existed, to profit from the suffering of people who deserved better. Briggs pressed harder.
Let me ask you about the incident in the mess hall. You testified that you accidentally bumped Sergeant Drummond's wheelchair. The video shows you making eye contact with him before speaking. Was that accidental? It was crowded. Things happen in crowded spaces. And the words you said to him about the war being over and him taking up space, were those accidental? Did you intend to say something else and those words just slipped out? Hastings' jaw clenched. I was frustrated. I'd just come from a difficult meeting. So, you took that frustration out on a 73-year-old veteran in a wheelchair who was trying to eat breakfast, a veteran whose benefits you had been deliberately delaying for over a year, a veteran you knew was struggling financially because of those delays. Does that about sum it up? You're twisting everything. I'm using your own words, Captain. Your emails, your recorded statements, your documented actions. The only thing I'm adding is context, and that context shows a pattern of deliberate cruelty motivated by personal financial gain. That's not a twist, that's the truth. Feldman objected, arguing that Briggs was making statements rather than asking questions. Morrison sustained the objection, but noted that counsel had made his point. When Briggs indicated he had no further questions, Hastings stepped down from the stand looking significantly less confident than when he had taken it. Feldman attempted to rehabilitate his testimony through closing arguments, returning to themes of stress, misunderstanding, and the unfairness of undercover investigation methods. But the damage was done. The evidence was overwhelming, the pattern was undeniable, and Hastings' own testimony had only reinforced the prosecution's case rather than creating doubt. Morrison called a brief recess to review all evidence before rendering his decision. I stood in the hallway outside the courtroom with Major Briggs, neither of us speaking much, both understanding that we had presented the strongest case possible and now had to trust the process. When we returned to the courtroom, Morrison had several pages of notes in front of him. He looked first at Hastings, then at Kaufman, then directly at me before speaking. Having reviewed all testimony, documentary evidence, and legal arguments presented in this preliminary hearing, I find that probable cause exists to believe that Captain Derek Hastings violated Articles 92, 93, 81, and 132 of the Uniform Code of Justice. The evidence demonstrates a systematic pattern of abuse of authority, deliberate obstruction of benefits processing, and financial fraud perpetrated against veterans under his command. This matter will proceed to General Court-Martial. He paused, shuffling his papers before continuing.
Regarding Lieutenant Bryce Kaufman, I find probable cause for violations of Article 92, dereliction of duty, based on his failure to report misconduct and his participation in creating a hostile environment for veterans. However, I do not find sufficient evidence at this time to support charges of conspiracy or fraud. His case will proceed to special court-martial on the lesser charges. Feldman immediately requested bail for his client. Morrison denied the request, citing flight risk and the serious nature of the charges. Hastings would remain in pretrial confinement pending the court-martial. Kaufman was released to his quarters under restriction with electronic monitoring to ensure compliance. As the hearing concluded and the courtroom began to empty, I saw Sergeant Drummond wheeling himself toward the exit. I caught up with him in the hallway. "Sergeant, thank you for your testimony today. I know that was difficult." He looked up at me with eyes that held something I had not seen before, not just resignation or exhaustion, but actual hope. "Colonel, do you think this will actually change anything, not just for me, but for the next veteran who needs help?" "I think it's a start. We're exposing a problem that's been allowed to fester because nobody wanted to confront it. That exposure is the first step toward fixing the system." He nodded slowly. "My daughter called me after she heard about the hearing. First time in months, she didn't sound worried about me. Just knowing that someone is fighting for us, that matters more than you might think." I watched him leave, navigating through the building with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned to operate in a world not designed for wheelchairs. Behind me, Major Briggs was packing up his files, preparing for the next phase of legal proceedings that would take weeks or months to fully resolve.
But we had cleared the first major hurdle. The case was moving forward. Hastings would face full accountability for what he had done, and every veteran who had been harmed by his scheme would see that the system, however slowly, could still deliver justice when pushed hard enough. The real fight was about to begin. The court-martial convened 6 weeks later in the main courtroom at Fort Donovan, a formal proceeding that drew attention from military media and veterans advocacy organizations across the country. The case had become something larger than just one corrupt officer. It represented a test of whether the military justice system would hold its own accountable when they failed the people they were supposed to serve. I arrived early on the first day, wearing my dress uniform with every ribbon and badge properly positioned. The courtroom was already filling with spectators. Veterans in wheelchairs lined one side of the gallery. Active duty soldiers sat in the back rows, watching quietly. Reporters occupied the press section, cameras ready to document everything that would unfold over the next week. The panel of officers who would serve as the jury filed in precisely at 0900 hours. 7 members, ranging in rank from captain to colonel, representing different branches and specialties. Their faces showed the seriousness they brought to this responsibility. They understood that their decision would resonate far beyond the single case. Captain Hastings entered flanked by his defense team, Marcus Feldman leading 2 junior attorneys who carried thick briefcases filled with motions and legal briefs. Hastings had lost weight during his pretrial confinement, his uniform hanging slightly loose on his frame, but his expression remained defiant, the look of someone who still believed he could talk his way out of consequences. The military judge, Colonel Thomas Hardwick, took the bench with the gravity befitting the proceedings. He had a reputation for running a tight courtroom, tolerating no theatrics from either side, focused solely on facts and law. After preliminary motions were addressed and jury instructions given, Major Briggs stood to deliver his opening statement. Members of the panel, over the next several days, the government will present evidence of systematic abuse perpetrated by Captain Derek Hastings against the very people who sacrificed the most for our nation. You will hear from veterans who served honorably, who returned home wounded in body and spirit, who deserved care and respect, but instead received cruelty and exploitation. You will see documents proving Captain Hastings deliberately obstructed their benefits for personal profit. You will hear his own words, recorded in emails and conversations, demonstrating calculated malice rather than mere incompetence. This is not a case about administrative mistakes. This is a case about a predator in uniform who betrayed every value we claim to uphold. Feldman's opening statement attempted to reframe the narrative, portraying Hastings as a dedicated officer, overwhelmed by an impossible workload, making difficult decisions in a broken system, ultimately scapegoated by an overzealous investigation seeking to justify its own existence. But his words felt hollow against the weight of evidence everyone knew was coming. The prosecution's case unfolded methodically over 3 days. Witness after witness took the stand, each adding another piece to the mosaic of abuse. Veterans described appointments where Hastings mocked their disabilities. Junior personnel testified about being ordered to misfile paperwork. Medical professionals explained how delays in benefits processing had caused genuine harm to people already struggling with service-connected injuries and illnesses. Sergeant Drummond's testimony anchored the entire proceeding. Major Briggs walked him through 14 months of bureaucratic torture. Each delay and dismissal documented with painful precision. When Briggs asked him to describe the lowest point, Drummond's voice remained steady, but his words cut deep. There was a night about 6 months ago when I sat at my kitchen table trying to decide which bills I could skip paying so I could afford my medications. I had given this country 32 years of service. I had been wounded twice defending freedoms I believed in. And I was sitting there wondering if I should just give up, stop fighting a system that clearly didn't want me around anymore. That's what Captain Hastings' delays did. They made me question whether my service had meant anything at all. The gallery was silent except for the quiet sound of someone crying. Even the panel members looked affected, their professional detachment cracking momentarily in the face of such raw honesty. Feldman's cross-examination tried to suggest Drummond's financial difficulties stemmed from poor money management rather than delayed benefits, but the attempt backfired badly. Drummond calmly produced his budget spreadsheet, showing exactly how he had stretched his limited resources, demonstrating fiscal responsibility that made Feldman's insinuation look insulting and desperate. The financial evidence consumed an entire day of testimony. Corporal Greenwood presented her forensic analysis with the precision of a surgeon, dissecting every transaction, every referral, every email that proved Hastings' scheme. The advocacy group's attorney testified about how Hastings had approached them with the proposal, how he had promised a steady stream of desperate veterans willing to pay for help navigating a system he controlled. Gerald Winters from the advocacy group took the stand looking like he wished he could be anywhere else. Under Briggs's questioning, he admitted the arrangement had made him uncomfortable from the beginning, but that he had rationalized it as helping veterans who otherwise would struggle with bureaucracy. Did you ever question why so many veterans Captain Hastings referred to you were experiencing unusual delays in their processing? Winters shifted in his seat. I started noticing patterns about 6 months ago. Veterans would tell me their paperwork kept getting lost or flagged for additional review without clear reasons. When I asked Captain Hastings about it, he said the system was just inefficient. Did you believe him? A long pause. I wanted to believe him, but the more I saw, the harder that became.
When Colonel Brennan's investigation started, I was almost relieved because it meant someone was finally asking the right questions. The emails between Hastings and Winters appeared on courtroom monitors throughout the day, each one more damning than the last. The panel members took extensive notes, their expressions growing darker as the scope of the conspiracy became undeniable. This was not administrative inefficiency. This was calculated exploitation of vulnerable people for profit. On the fourth day, the defense presented its case. Feldman called character witnesses who testified about Hastings' service record, his deployments, his previous good conduct. Colleagues described him as dedicated and hardworking. His former commanding officer praised his administrative efficiency. But none of it addressed the central evidence. Good past performance did not excuse present criminality. Hastings himself took the stand again, his testimony a repeat of the preliminary hearing with minor variations. He maintained that delays were legitimate, that his relationship with the advocacy group was ethical, that the investigation had been conducted improperly. Feldman led him through carefully scripted responses designed to create sympathy and doubt. But then came Major Briggs's cross-examination, and the carefully constructed defense began to collapse. Captain Hastings, you've testified that you were operating within a broken system, doing your best under difficult circumstances. Let me ask you about a specific case. Sergeant Howard Drummond. His medical documentation was complete. His disability ratings were certified by 3 separate physicians. His service record was exemplary. What legitimate reason existed for his case to take 14 months? There were complications that required additional review. What complications, specifically? Hastings glanced at his attorney. I would need to review the file to provide specific details. Fortunately, I have the file right here. Briggs held up a thick folder. I've reviewed every page. There are no complications. There are no red flags. There is absolutely nothing that would justify 14 months of processing. In fact, there are notes in the file, in your handwriting, that say, quote, hold for 30 days, pending verification. Those notes appear 6 times, each dated roughly 30 days after the previous one. Captain Hastings, what were you verifying during those 6 separate 30-day holds? Silence filled the courtroom. Hastings had no answer because there was no legitimate answer. The holds have been arbitrary, designed solely to create frustration and desperation. Briggs pressed harder. Let me read you another email. This one is dated 2 weeks after Sergeant Drummond first inquired about his case status. You wrote to Mr. Winters, got a good one for you, elderly vet, Vietnam era, desperate for money.
Perfect candidate for your services. He'll pay whatever you ask because he has no other options. Can you explain what you meant by that? I was simply providing information about a potential client. You described a veteran under your authority whose benefits you controlled as having no other options. You were creating those constraints deliberately, weren't you? Making sure he had no choice but to pay for help because you were blocking the free assistance he was entitled to? That's not what I intended, but it's what you did. And you profited from it. $75,000 over 30 months. How much of that did you spend while veterans you were supposed to be helping struggled to afford their medications? Feldman objected repeatedly, arguing harassment and badgering, but Judge Hardwick overruled him each time. The questions were relevant, the tone appropriate for cross-examination of a defendant facing serious charges. When Hastings finally stepped down, he looked defeated in a way he had not at the preliminary hearing. The weight of his own words, his own documented actions, had become inescapable even for him. Closing arguments stretched into late afternoon. Feldman did his best to create doubt, suggesting the evidence could be interpreted differently, that Hastings' intentions had been misunderstood, that the investigation itself had been tainted by bias. But his arguments felt like throwing pebbles at a mountain, insignificant against the overwhelming mass of proof. Major Briggs's closing statement was simple and devastating. Members of the panel, you have heard from veterans who gave everything for this country and were repaid with cruelty. You have seen documents proving deliberate obstruction and fraud. You have read emails where Captain Hastings celebrated his exploitation of vulnerable people. There is no ambiguity here. There is no room for doubt. He violated his oath. He betrayed his uniform. He harmed the people he was sworn to protect. Your duty is clear. Find him guilty on all charges and send the message that this behavior will never be tolerated in our military. The panel deliberated for 6 hours. I spent that time in a small conference room with Major Briggs, neither of us able to focus on anything else. Staff Sergeant Silva brought coffee that went cold while we waited. Corporal Greenwood organized files we no longer needed just to have something to do with her hands. When the bailiff finally called us back to the courtroom, the evening sun was casting long shadows through the windows. The panel members filed in wearing expressions that gave nothing away. Judge Hardwick asked if they had reached a verdict. The panel president, a colonel with 30 years of service, stood. We have, Your Honor. What is your finding on the charge of conduct unbecoming an officer? Guilty. On the charge of cruelty and maltreatment? Guilty. On the charge of fraud against the United States? Guilty. The verdicts continued, guilty on every count. Hastings' face went pale, then red, his hands gripping the defense table hard enough that his knuckles turned white. Feldman placed a steadying hand on his shoulder, but there was nothing that could soften this blow. Sentencing proceedings followed 2 days later. The prosecution presented impact statements from veterans whose lives had been damaged by Hastings' scheme. One man described losing his home while waiting for benefits that should have been processed months earlier. A woman testified about her husband's suicide, which she believed was linked to the stress of fighting a bureaucracy that seemed designed to break him. Sergeant Drummond spoke about the dignity that had been stripped from him piece by piece until he barely recognized himself. The panel deliberated on sentencing for 3 hours before returning with their decision. Judge Hardwick read it aloud in the formal language of military justice. Dishonorable discharge, forfeiture of all pay and benefits, reduction to the rank of private, 5 years confinement in a military prison. Additionally, restitution to be paid to every veteran whose benefits had been delayed, totaling over $200,000. Hastings was led from the courtroom in handcuffs. His military career ended in the most disgraceful manner possible. Feldman filed notice of appeal, but everyone knew it was perfunctory. The evidence was too strong, the verdict too well supported. The appeal would fail. Lieutenant Kaufman's court-martial followed a week later, a much shorter proceeding given the lesser charges. He was found guilty of dereliction of duty and failure to report misconduct, sentenced to reduction in rank, 6 months confinement, and a bad conduct discharge. His military career was over, his future permanently marked by his failure to stand up against abuse he had witnessed daily. In the weeks that followed, I oversaw the expedited processing of benefits for every veteran who had been harmed by Hastings' scheme. Working with Colonel Vance and a team from the benefits office, we pushed through 47 cases in 30 days, ensuring each veteran received everything they were owed, plus compensation for the delays they had endured. The red tape that had seemed insurmountable under Hastings' management disappeared when people actually committed to serving rather than obstructing.
Sergeant Drummond's case was among the first completed. I delivered the final paperwork to him personally, meeting him again at the coffee shop where we had talked before the preliminary hearing. He reviewed the documents with careful attention, his hands more steady than I had ever seen them. "It's all here," he said quietly. "Everything I was promised. Everything I earned. You should never have had to fight this hard for it." He looked up at me with eyes that held something I had not seen in our previous meetings. Not just relief or gratitude, but a restoration of something fundamental. Self-worth that had been systematically attacked was beginning to rebuild. "Colonel, can I ask you something? When you stood up in that mess hall, when you revealed who you were, you could have waited, built your case quietly. Why did you do it right then?" I thought about that morning. About the coffee staining his ribbons, about the choice between investigative patience and immediate justice. Because some moments require action rather than calculation. Because watching someone abuse their authority over a person who had sacrificed so much, I couldn't stay silent, even one more minute. Sometimes doing the right thing means accepting the complications that follow. He nodded slowly. "My daughter wants to meet you. She said you gave her father back to her. Not just the benefits, but the belief that his service mattered, that someone was willing to fight for him the way he fought for this country. I'd be honored to meet her." We sat together for a while longer, drinking coffee that was actually hot this time, talking about his plans now that his benefits were secure. He was considering volunteering at a local veterans center, helping other former service members navigate the benefits process, using what he had learned to make the path easier for those who would follow. The Calhoun Foundation that Charles had mentioned in the original story inspired something similar at Fort Donovan. Colonel Vance approved the creation of a veteran advocacy office, staffed by personnel trained specifically to help veterans through the benefits process, to ensure no one else would face the kind of systematic obstruction Hastings had created. Mrs. Chen was hired to run the office, her 2 decades of experience finally put to use in service rather than documentation of abuse. The case attracted national attention. Military news outlets covered the trial extensively, using it to highlight broader issues in how the armed forces treated wounded and retiring veterans. Congressional committees held hearings about benefits processing delays across all services. Policy changes were implemented requiring regular audits and oversight to prevent similar abuses from developing in other installations. I received a commendation from the Inspector General's office for the investigation, though the recognition felt less important than the tangible changes that resulted from it. Awards and ribbons meant something, but ensuring veterans were treated with dignity meant everything. 3 months after the sentencing, I attended a ceremony at the Fort Donovan Veterans Memorial Garden. A new plaque was being dedicated, honoring not any specific soldier, but the principle that service deserves respect, that sacrifice requires acknowledgement, that the bond between military and veteran is sacred and must never be exploited. Sergeant Drummond was there, positioned near the front in his wheelchair. Mrs. Chen stood beside him, along with dozens of other veterans whose cases had been expedited after Hastings' conviction. They had formed something of a community, supporting each other through the recovery process, not just from their physical wounds, but from the institutional betrayal they had endured. Colonel Vance spoke at the ceremony about accountability and commitment, about the military's obligation to honor those who had worn the uniform. She acknowledged that the system had failed, that individuals in positions of trust had violated that trust, but that the response to failure was not to hide it, but to fix it and ensure it never happened again. When she finished speaking, she invited me to say a few words. I had not prepared a speech, but standing before that gathering of veterans and active duty soldiers, the words came naturally. I spent 3 weeks pretending to be someone I wasn't, documenting abuse that should never have been allowed to continue. I watched good people being treated as burdens instead of heroes. I saw a system that had lost sight of its purpose. But I also saw courage in the veterans who kept showing up, kept fighting for what they were owed even when the process seemed designed to break them.
I saw integrity in the people who witnessed wrongdoing and waited for someone to finally listen to their concerns. And I saw justice in a legal system that, despite its imperfections, ultimately held the powerful accountable for their crimes. I paused, looking at the faces gathered in the memorial garden. Wearing this uniform means accepting responsibility for those who wore it before us and those who will wear it after us. It means protecting the vulnerable rather than exploiting them. It means understanding that authority is not license for cruelty, but obligation for service. Captain Hastings forgot those principles. This memorial stands as a reminder that we never will. The applause that followed was subdued, respectful, the kind of acknowledgement that meant more than loud celebration. After the ceremony concluded, people approached me to shake my hand, to share their own stories, to express hope that things were genuinely changing. Sergeant Drummond wheeled himself over as the crowd began to disperse. "Colonel, I wanted you to have something." He handed me a folded paper, worn at the edges like it had been carried for a long time. I opened it carefully. It was a letter, handwritten in the careful script of someone who wanted every word to count. I wrote that the night before the court-martial began. I wanted to make sure someone knew what your investigation meant, even if everything went wrong in the trial. But now, I want you to have it as a reminder that what you did mattered. Not just for the case, but for everyone who felt invisible until you made us seen again. The letter described his journey from proud service member to forgotten veteran, from daily struggle to restored dignity. But the final paragraph stayed with me long after I finished reading. I used to think the system was broken beyond repair, that people in authority would always protect each other before they protected us. You proved that wrong, not by being perfect, but by being willing to fight when it would have been easier to look away. That's what real leadership looks like. That's what honor means when it's more than just a word in a manual. I folded the letter carefully and thanked him, my voice not quite steady. These were the moments that mattered more than any commendation or promotion, the human connections that reminded me why the work was important. As I drove away from Fort Donovan that evening, watching the sun set behind the base headquarters building, I thought about how close we had come to letting Hastings' cruelty continue unchecked. How many other installations might have similar problems, hiding in administrative offices, protected by indifference and the assumption that the system was working as intended? The fight against institutional abuse was not won with a single court-martial. It required constant vigilance, a willingness to question authority, courage to stand up even when standing up created complications. It required remembering that every policy, every procedure, every bureaucratic process affected real people with real lives that deserved respect and consideration. My phone buzzed with a message from Colonel Vance. New assignment orders came through. Pentagon wants you to lead a task force reviewing benefits processing across all installations. Seems your investigation impressed some people in high places. Interested? I pulled over to respond properly.
The work would be difficult, requiring travel to bases across the country, confronting entrenched systems and resistant command structures. It would mean more fights like the one at Fort Donovan, more evidence to collect, more cases to build, more officers who believed they were untouchable learning otherwise. But I thought about Sergeant Drummond sitting in that mess hall with coffee staining his ribbons, about the 47 veterans whose benefits had been deliberately delayed, about every service member who had ever felt invisible to the institution they had served. I typed my response. When do I start? The fight was far from over, but at least now we knew it could be won. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.